Is NATO still worth it for the United States in 2025? Is there a better alternative, more aligned with America's national interest? Founded in 1949 to counter Soviet aggression, NATO was a Cold War success story, but with the Soviet Union gone for 34 years, why are we still pouring billions into it? From disproportionate US funding to Europe's shifting demographics and unwillingness to defend itself, I'll explore a number of reasons why NATO is no longer fit for America's national interest. Plus, I'll make the case for a bold alternative, exiting NATO and forming a strategic alliance with Russia. Could this save money, align values, and foster peace? Let's break it down. I am, of course, Attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense, and if you like our content, then I'd like to ask you to hit that like and subscribe button, contribute to the chat, ring that bell. That all really helps us out, and it's free. As always, when seeking to arrive at a clear-eyed, fact-based understanding of current circumstances, especially to facilitate sound decision-making, I like to start from first principles and move forward from there. So, why do we have a NATO in the first place? NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded in 1949 as a strategic military defense alliance consisting of the United States and 11 European nations in the aftermath of World War II and the subsequent nuclear weaponized Cold War that became the world's new strategic reality. Although the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies in World War II, the Cold War set in with the US and the Soviet Union facing off against each other, with Europe squeezed between them. The purpose of NATO was to assure its members that if the Soviet Union attacked any one of them, presumably a European member, that the United States would be treaty-bound to come to their defense against the Soviet aggression. And it worked. The Soviet Union never did invade Europe. Awesome. Success. The question for the United States today, however, is whether our continued membership in a much expanded NATO still makes sense. Or alternatively, is it arguably long past time for the United States to exit NATO in its own national interest? More succinctly, is the NATO juice still worth the squeeze? I propose that the answer is not only isn't NATO juice worth the squeeze, in fact, the NATO juice has become a dangerous poison that the United States would do well to distance itself from immediately. I also propose that not only is leaving NATO inherently in the national interest of the United States on its own merits, leaving NATO also opens the door to much more advantageous strategic alliances that our current NATO membership precludes us from pursuing. And as another matter of first principle, every nation ultimately has as its highest moral obligation to its citizens the pursuit of its own national interests. And continued United States membership in NATO violates that vital first principle. Imagine the worst has happened and you've been compelled to defend yourself, your family, or your property from a criminal predator. Fortunately, you win the physical fight, but now you have to also win the legal fight that follows. The cost of that legal battle can be enormous, easily hundreds of thousands of dollars, and trust me, how much money you can bring to the legal fight really does affect your chances of being found guilty or not. The good news is that you can guarantee you have the resources you need to be hard to convict with the backing of CCW Safe, a provider of legal service memberships. There are various self-defense insurance companies out there, and some of them are horrifically bad. CCW Safe is the one that I most trust to protect me and my family. I'm personally a member, and so is my wife. I urge you to learn more about why I trust and choose CCW Safe for myself and my family by pointing your browser to lawofselfdefense.com/trust. And at the same place, you'll find a discount code to save 10% off your membership at CCW Safe as well. Whatever utility NATO provided in blunting Soviet aggression, and I'm happy to concede that it did, the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. For those bad at math, that's 34 years ago. So for more than 3 decades, the core reason for NATO has been non-existent. Of course, as is the nature of giant bureaucracies, there is an inherent inertia to their existence, which is why the zombified corpse of NATO has continued to stagger along, moaning for the Soviet brains that no longer exist. Much of this continued staggering is the result of the vast sums of money that continue to be pumped into the living corpse of NATO. And where there is money, there are people who enrich themselves from that pool of wealth. The vaster the supply of money, the vaster the waste, fraud, and abuse that is inevitable to any bureaucracy over time. And the sheer mass of money we're talking about is another facet of why NATO is no longer fit for service in the context of America's national interest. America bears by far the largest share and a disproportionate share of the cost of NATO. The total NATO budget for 2024 was about $1.5 trillion, with varied contributions from its now 30 members. The United States bears almost $1 trillion, or 66% of that total. So a large majority of the burden in terms of absolute dollars. Notably, the United States also bears a disproportionate burden as a share of national GDP. The U.S. spends nearly 4% of its GDP on its share of NATO expenses, where other nation members are committed to only paying 2% of their GDP, and these nations routinely fail to meet even this much reduced obligation. Many Americans often wonder why the United States is making such an outsized contribution to NATO more than 30 years after its core purposes ended, in both absolute and relative terms, while watching the other member nations of NATO instead spend their own money on vast social safety networks for their own citizens, including free health care and lavish vacation and retirement plans. Why are Americans carrying a disproportionate burden of the military defense of Europe just so the Europeans can live lives of greater luxury? All of this spending might have made sense to defend America's European allies from Soviet aggression when the Soviet Union existed as a threat, but not only has the Soviet Union collapsed decades ago, our European allies in 2025 look less and less like they did in 1949 when NATO was founded with each passing year. A disconnect accelerating hard in recent years, and that's yet another reason why NATO is no longer fit for service in the context of America's national interest. America's nominal European allies are simply not the nations they were when America agreed to found NATO and contribute disproportionately to Europe's defense against Soviet aggression. Especially over the last decade, the Western European nations at the core of NATO on the European continent have been engaged in an aggressive campaign to profoundly alter their demographic makeup by importing tens of millions of third world migrants from Islamic regions of the globe, from Africa, from India. These migrants naturally bring with them cultures and values that vary wildly from those established in Europe over many centuries and carried over to the New World and ultimately to America. The other founding members of NATO in 1949 included the United Kingdom, then populated 99% by British people, and France, then populated 99% by French people, and Canada, then populated 99% by Canadian people, and Portugal, then populated 99% by the Portuguese, and so forth. Walk around the urban capitals of many of these NATO founding nations today, and you might begin to think you're instead walking the streets of some third world nation with few, if any, culturally European citizens. Each of those nations has massive populations of third world migrants whose worldviews and societal norms and expectations are simply not aligned with those of their host nations, and even less so with those of the United States. The United Kingdom, the France, the Canada, the Portugal of 1949, with whom the United States agreed to enter a strategic mutual defense pact, simply no longer exist in 2025. And as a consequence, whatever alignment of national interest the United States may have had with these NATO founding nations in 1949 is enormously attenuated and perhaps not at all existing in 2025. Their national interests and America's national interests are simply no longer adequately aligned to justify the commitments of NATO, and the severity of those commitments to nations not well aligned is yet another reason why NATO is no longer fit for service in the context of America's national interest. The lack of aligned national interests is extremely perilous, given the severity of the mutual aid commitments demanded by NATO. Not only have even the dozen co-founding nations of NATO changed dramatically in culture since the organization's founding, but the organization has also more than doubled in size to include 30 far-flung nations with increasingly tenuous internal alignments of national interest. Like any social circle, the larger the number of participants, the more likely that one or more will find themselves entangled in the consequences of poor decision-making. Does America really want to find itself on the hook if NATO member nations like Slovenia or Estonia or Montenegro or Slovakia, all nations that few Americans could readily locate on a globe, manage to get themselves entangled in some military affair? Because that's the commitment that's at the heart of the NATO treaty, especially its Article 5, which calls on every NATO member to treat an attack on any one of them as an attack on all of them. If Slovenia or Estonia or Montenegro or Slovakia get embroiled in a military conflict, is America really prepared to sacrifice its military men in their defense? Really? It's also worth noting that even when we look at the traditional Western European members of NATO, whether the United States should be prepared to sacrifice its military men to even their defense is a question worth re-examining. The harsh truth is that when asked, the citizens of those very Western European nations state outright that they are unwilling to fight even in defense of their own nation. This image here represents the percentage of citizens polled who say that they would be willing to fight for their own nation, and the results are chilling. In France, only 29% would be willing to fight for France. In the United Kingdom, only 27% would be willing to fight for the United Kingdom. In Italy, only 20%. In Germany, only 18%. In the Netherlands, only 15%. If they're not willing to defend themselves, why should America be willing to suffer that cost on their behalf? Another reason why NATO is no longer fit for service in the context of America's national interest is that it has become a tool of international politics that serves the interests of other nations and nation-adjacent actors at the cost of the United States' broader national interest. We see this playing out in real time in Ukraine right now. The Russia that exists today, following the collapse of the broader Soviet Union in 1991, has watched NATO with exactly the interest one would expect would be directed at a hostile military alliance organization. Russia, of course, observed that the NATO created as a barrier to the risk of Soviet aggression did not cease existing after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead, it became redirected at Russia. More alarming than NATO's mere continued existence, however, was the continuous and rapid expansion of this hostile military alliance towards ever closer proximity to Russia's borders. Americans have been so long conditioned to think of Russia as America's inherent enemy that perhaps it's worth contextualizing this expansion of NATO by looking into the mirror ourselves. What if there was an expansive military alliance made up of varied, say, Asian nations that was dominated by a China hostile to America's national interests? And what if China continuously and rapidly expanded the membership of that Asian military alliance to include nations increasingly more proximate to America's borders? In Brazil, in Cuba, in Mexico, in Canada? And soon enough, America had Chinese troops running exercises, building military bases, flying sorties, just across our border in Mexico and Canada? No big deal? Or would the United States consider such expansion of a hostile military alliance to our borders to be a threat to our national security? The answer in that context is obvious. Any such expansion of a hostile military alliance towards America's borders would be considered a threat to our national security approaching an act of war. What's obvious in the context of our own national interest, however, seems more difficult for people to grasp when viewed from the Russia perspective. After the United States overthrew the elected Ukrainian government in 2014 and installed its own puppet regime, mostly to facilitate the launch of a massive money laundering operation from which corrupt American politicians secured tremendous personal wealth, well, discussions began to heat up to have Ukraine join both the European Union as well as NATO. It should go without saying that NATO establishing itself on the lengthy and vulnerable border that Ukraine shares with Russia could only be seen by Russia as an intrinsic threat to its national security. hence the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia suddenly going militarily hot a few years ago, with the current cost in lives being in the hundreds of thousands. Russia's perception of a NATO-orchestrated attack on its national security can only have been made sharper when the NATO nations, including the United States, began supplying Ukraine with massive quantities of weapons used to slaughter hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. This war, of course, simply ramped up that trough of waste, fraud, and abuse that the Ukraine debacle offered to politicians and others to enrich themselves, and indeed things now appear to be at a scale where powerful forces would prefer that the slaughter continue as a forever war, rather than their access to illicit wealth be eliminated. They're also understandably terrified that a cessation of hostilities and the return of Ukraine to an elected and accountable government might reveal their years of looting and graft. Certainly, it's in the interest of those powerful forces for the slaughter in Ukraine to continue for as long as possible. But is it in Ukraine's interest? Is it in Russia's interest? And most importantly, is it in America's interest? Why is America allowing itself to be the wallet of the Western European NATO members who wish to continue this forever war until what? Until there are no Ukrainian men of military age left alive to fight? President Trump has recently taken it upon himself to try to craft a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, based on long-standing principles of international diplomacy. But we saw in the manner that Ukraine's dictator Zelensky imploded those negotiations at the final step, right in the Oval Office itself, just how powerful are the drivers to continue the forever war forever. And even as Zelensky's wife was in the media purchasing an $18 million Bugatti automobile. Shortly after Zelensky collapsed the almost concluded peace arrangements, Trump ordered that American supplies of weapons and other provisions would cease immediately to Ukraine. Clearly, Trump believes it is not in America's interest to remain embroiled in the Ukraine forever war, and I, for one, agree 100%. So far, I've covered a number of substantive reasons why NATO is no longer fit for service in the context of America's national interest, and in the interest of time, I'll close out with one more. America's involvement in NATO is not only unsound and not aligned with our national interests on its own merits, that involvement precludes America from pursuing alternative alliances that are arguably much better aligned with our national interest. For example, it seems apparent to me that America's national interest would be far better served by a strategic alliance with modern Russia than is its current alliance with NATO. Replacing NATO with an alliance with Russia would save us enormous NATO membership costs. It would stop us subsidizing European social safety nets, free healthcare, lavish vacation and retirement arrangements on the backs of the American defense budget. Unlike the Western European nations, Russia has not been engaged in a decade of replacing its culturally Russian people with tens of millions of imported third world migrants from Islamic and African and Indian areas of the globe. This sustained homogeneity of culture is reflected in the relatively high percentage of Russians who say they would fight to defend Russia. While at 59%, the figure may seem low to American eyes, it's literally double or triple the rate at which the citizens of the United Kingdom or France or Spain or Italy or Germany say they are prepared to fight for their own nations. Further, instead of dealing with 30 fractious and disparate nations of a NATO alliance that's unfit for purpose, we could replace all that troublesome noise with a single, large strategic partner in Russia. The United States and Russia also have many opportunities for mutually beneficial exchange of goods, products, and services across our markets, especially Russia's vast natural resources and mineral wealth, so desperately needed for America's modern technologies. And whereas backing Ukraine in its conflict with Russia involves the expenditure of enormous quantities of American wealth, largely only so powerful people can enrich themselves at the giant money laundering machine that is Ukraine, backing Russia in that conflict would simply require us doing nothing. The conflict cannot be sustained by Ukraine absent America's ongoing support, which would naturally be withdrawn. Indeed, America's withdrawal from NATO would certainly tend towards fostering far less international acrimony and greater peace, as NATO could hardly continue its ongoing hostile expansion towards Russian borders absent American funding, And indeed, the very military capacity of NATO, even as it currently exists, would fall to a fraction of its current levels without the backing of the United States, greatly diminishing its threat profile from Russia's perspective. To wrap up then, ultimately that's my proposal. It is in America's national interest to exit from NATO immediately and to instead explore a strategic alliance with Russia. Let me know what you think in the comments. And again, if you like our content, then I'd like to ask you to hit those like and subscribe buttons, ring that bell. It really helps us out, and it's free. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca at lawofselfdefense.com. Stay safe.